Good day to all of you. Welcome to the VAT session of our Tax and Development Days. My name is Piet Batjo, and I have the privilege of leading the OECD's work on value-added taxes and on consumption taxes more generally. We are absolutely honored and delighted that you have chosen to join us in such great numbers today. I'm actually really impressed about the numbers of you joining us at this time of the day. The main purpose of this relatively short session is obviously not to engage in any kind of detailed technical discussion. We don't have the time for that, but rather the intention is to update you on our activities during the last year. We will focus especially obviously on our work to assist developing economies in adjusting their VAT systems to the need of the e-commerce environment, which is constantly growing and evolving, as we all know. Perhaps even more important, we want to use this opportunity and our time together today to highlight how interested developing economies can become actively or even more actively involved in our work, and how we may be able to assist you all, how we may be able to assist countries, including developing countries, in further addressing the VAT challenges of the digital economy. After my presentation on the current status of our work and on our plans for the immediate future, I will be joined by a number of very dear colleagues from around the world who will share some of their perspectives on VAT reform in response to e-commerce growth and on our cooperation in that context. If we can move on to the first slide of the presentation for today. As you can see on the slide that is currently on your screen, inclusive engagement with tax authorities worldwide is part of our DNA. Very close cooperation with OECD members as well as with non-members. And capacity building is integral to our work on VAT. In practice, this means that we develop standards and guidance on VAT design and administration in a truly consultative manner, based on the sharing of analysis and experience, and with a view to identifying consensus solutions that are active and feasible, that are effective and feasible to implement by tax authorities worldwide. So just in a nutshell, in terms of developing global policy solutions for global problems, our aim is to provide a platform where tax authorities work together, where tax authorities come together to develop common solutions for common problems, solutions that make sense and that work well in practice across jurisdictions. Now, when developing these solutions, it is important to build in the necessary flexibility so that jurisdictions can adjust their approaches to specific needs and circumstances, but without creating inconsistencies across jurisdictions that could result in trade obstacles, in compliance complexity, and in competitive distortions. So that's basically the dimension on the top right side of the slide that you have in front of you there, the component of developing inclusive international standards. Now, these solutions are obviously worth nothing when they only exist on paper. They only add real value when they are implemented by jurisdictions in an effective and efficient manner. And therefore, a critical component of our activities, which is actually highlighted on sort of the bottom two quadrants of the circle on your slide, a critical component of our activities is therefore to assist tax authorities in implementing our VAT standards, the standards and guidance that we have developed collectively. So to assist tax authorities in implementing those into national law and practice. And what does this involve? This involves a wide range of activities, including the development of e-learning modules in multiple languages, the organization of workshops, the delivery of detailed manuals, and increasingly also the delivery of bespoke bilateral technical assistance to interested jurisdictions. All of this work has continued over the last 2 years, despite the COVID-19 restrictions and circumstances. Much of that has been done online in a virtual fashion. But like Pascal Saint-Amand just pointed out earlier, we are very much looking forward to, again, engaging into interpersonal relationship and interpersonal dialogue, debate, and interaction rather sooner than later. If we move on to the next slide, you will see, and already hinted at that in the previous slide, is that much of our work has focused on e-commerce and digital trade more generally. And as you can see on the slide, this should probably not come as a surprise. More people around the world are now shopping online than ever before. More people are more shopping online than ever before. And therefore, online shopping continues to boom in every region on the planet, as you see on the left-hand side of the slide, which shows impressive growth figures, double-digit growth figures across the world. What is probably interesting to highlight on the right side of the slide there is that certainly since the COVID-19 outbreak and taking into account COVID-19 restrictions, combined with the capacity for people to increasingly use their mobile devices for online shopping, we have seen exceptionally strong growth around the world in online shopping during the last 2 years. And as a result, we see that online shopping now represents an increasingly large share of all retail sales. We're quickly reaching 20% of all retail sales, which has now gone online. And we're actually not sure whether these data on the slide there effectively cover or already give a good indication or a good, a precise reflection of the impact that COVID-19 has had on the increase in online shopping. If we go to the next slide, we can spend a couple of words on what the VAT dimension is of all this. What is the connection between the growth in e-commerce globally and VAT policy? Well, of course, on the one hand, it's probably always useful to remember that VAT is a critical source of tax revenues for about 170 countries worldwide. The number keeps increasing, but probably we've reached more or less the maximum number of countries that will implement or that are already operating a VAT. But especially for developing countries, VAT is often a critical source of revenue, as it often accounts for 30% or more of total taxes, and very often together with other consumption taxes, other taxes on goods and services, represents the most important source of revenue for these economies. So typically developing and emerging economies. And obviously retail sales are the core tax base for VAT. Countries that haven't adjusted their VAT regimes effectively to ensure that they also cover e-commerce see an increasingly large share of their tax base evaporate. They see an increasingly large share of their tax base escape taxation as e-commerce continues to grow. This leads not only to growing revenue losses, but also to increasingly unsustainable competitive distortion between brick and mortar stores and online merchants. The main challenges in this space include identifying online transactions that should be subject to VAT, just knowing what is going on, and particularly to collect the VAT from online merchants and platforms that are often located abroad. These issues are now well known, I think, and the good news is that effective solutions are now also available. If we move on to the next slide, we'll see what has been produced at our end over the last couple of months. Obviously, VAT reform directed at e-commerce is very high on the agenda for governments worldwide. And we have continued to assist governments in addressing their needs for reform as shown on this slide. On the top right corner of the slide, you see that we have delivered a new report with in-depth analysis and guidance, focusing on the specific VAT challenges of the sharing and gig economy and the sharing and gig economy growth, which has been significant in many countries in recent years, not least in many developing economies. We have delivered a VAT digital toolkit for Latin America and the Caribbean in English and in Spanish, which you will see on the right bottom corner of the slide. So delivered in English and in Spanish. And this is essentially a detailed manual that covers all of the components of VAT reform directed at e-commerce. all of the necessary reform to ensure that VAT can be collected properly on digital trade activities. It has been accompanied by Spanish language supporting material, including e-learning modules, and the Spanish language version of our core standards on VAT, which has also been released in the course of last year. Now, this is part of a broader project to deliver similar toolkits for Asia Pacific and Africa, which we are delivering in a close strategic partnership with the World Bank Group and with regional partners for each of the regions that will be covered by these toolkits, as outlined on the top left-hand corner of the slides. So the Asian Development Bank for the Asia Pacific work, CEAT and the Inter-American Development Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean, and ATAF for Africa. The VAT Digital Toolkit for Asia Pacific is basically ready and will be released in the coming weeks, and work on the toolkit for Africa together with the World Bank Group and with ATAF is well on the way. If we go to the next slide, you will see a bit more detail on what these toolkits look like. As I said, they are detailed manuals. They're very technical, very detailed, and it covers essentially all the key implementation and operational aspects of e-commerce VAT reform into a pretty granular level of detail. It covers the policy design aspects, including analysis of policy of reform needs, and analysis of possible approaches, guidance, not so much models, but guidance on legislative reform, how to build the infrastructure and the underlying administrative framework to support registration and compliance processes, communication strategy, project planning, effective audit and risk management strategies, concrete measures to tackle VAT fraud associated with online trade, the entire spectrum in quite some detail. The toolkit for Latin America and the Caribbean, I think in total covers about 500 pages. Now, we don't expect anyone to read this from page 1 to page 500. It's rather a manual that can be used by a range of experts within tax administration, which each of their specific aspects covered in detail within the toolkit. Moving on to the next slide, having a quick look at where we are or where the world is in terms of implementation of the solution. We see here on this slide that a growing number of countries worldwide, including developing economies, have already implemented the reforms for online services and digital products, such as music and video streaming, app purchases, gambling, etc. You probably know better than I do what is available within your regions in that space. You see that we're closing the 80 jurisdictions mark, so the mark of 80 jurisdictions that have already implemented the recommended reform for online services and digital products. And you see on the right-hand side of the slide that revenues have been very positive. And very often revenues have been higher than initially budgeted. What is probably interesting and important to note is that several countries have signaled a particularly strong growth of VAT collected on online services and digital products since the COVID-19 outbreak. And again, these data are not yet reflected in the revenue data that you see there. It's important to note and to bear in mind that obviously the revenue potential is significant, but on the flip side is that the revenue at risk and the risk of revenue forgone is also increasing as e-commerce grows. It's also important to note that compliance levels have generally been quite high, certainly in countries whose regime is relatively close or very close to the guidelines and to the recommendations that we have developed collectively at the OECD level together with you all. And the global business community strongly encourages countries to implement solutions that are as close as possible to the OECD standards, as this typically allows them to already use their existing compliance systems and processes to comply with VAT requirements across jurisdictions. If we move on to the next slide, which focuses on low-value imported goods, we see that the reform focus is now increasingly shifting to VAT collection on online sales of retail goods, so tangible goods that are often imported from abroad. The need for VAT reform in that context has become increasingly urgent, now that tax authorities and customs authorities are faced with a daily tsunami of goods reaching their borders that have been sold online and that often enter the country free of VAT under traditional rules. The recommended solution there is essentially to move the responsibility for VAT collections on those goods to digital platforms and the online merchants that sell the imported goods before the goods reach the border. That will relieve the customs authorities from having to effectively collect the tax at the time of importation, so that customs authorities can rather focus on their key border protection functions rather than on collecting the VAT on large numbers or relatively low value parcels. Reform in this area is more limited for the moment, and it's more recent, for the simple reason that it's more complex to implement due to the interaction with customs procedure. But the results in the countries that have already implemented the reform are equally impressive, as you can see on the slide. And more importantly, they continue to grow as well as, again, e-commerce, including in the retail goods space, continues to grow. Again, it illustrates the revenue potential, but also the risk of growing revenue losses and competitive distortion in the absence of action. So moving on to the last slide for the moment of this presentation, which has a quick look at what is coming next. So what are our plans for this year? Our policy dialogue with tax authorities is increasingly focusing on the enforcement dimension, although compliance levels with the recommended solutions for VAT collection on digital trade are relatively high. It is obviously still important for tax authorities to have the capacity to identify associated risks, including newly emerging risks. It is important that they can effectively monitor and manage those risks, and that they can take effective enforcement action where needed. And we will be organizing, we have already started organizing policy dialogue among tax authorities worldwide to share analysis and experience, to identify best practices, and to explore possibilities for further administrative cooperation where appropriate. We will deliver the VAT Digital Toolkit for Asia Pacific in the coming weeks, and the toolkit for Africa by mid-2022, so in the next couple of months. Meanwhile, our focus is increasingly shifting to bespoke technical assistance for interested jurisdictions and respond to rising demand for such technical assistance from developing economies. We have already worked with a number of jurisdictions to assist them in implementing distinct components of VAT reform directed at e-commerce, and we will now be rolling out a more robust program in response to the growing demand. And this can include assistance on all components of the necessary reform, including policy and legal design, development of the underlying infrastructure, or at least assistance in developing the underlying infrastructure, the development of a risk management strategy, you name it. So I will stop here with my update. I will call upon a number of colleagues to share their perspectives in a minute, and I'd like already to ask our speakers to already activate their camera if they haven't done so yet. But I would first like to wholeheartedly thank our donors, whose logos are on this slide, for making this work possible. None of what I've just briefly described to you could have been done without the critical assistance from these donors. So our wholehearted thanks for the support. Please also do not hesitate to reach out to us via the email address on the slide that you have in front of you if you have any further questions. And certainly do not hesitate to express any interest that you may have for technical assistance to support your e-commerce VAT reform. You see on the right bottom side of the slide there the email address, my email address, where you can reach out if you are interested in receiving technical assistance on VAT and e-commerce. So with that, I think we can remove the slides for now and start sort of the second part of our session, where I'm delighted to welcome our colleagues from the World Bank Group, from ATAF, from Chile, and from Georgia. Just a quick reminder that meanwhile, don't hesitate to raise your hands if you want to intervene later. I see already, Anissa, you have raised your hand. Also, don't hesitate to comment via the chat. We will first go through a round of sort of testimonials with our colleagues, and then we will open the floor for further interaction with the floor. So first of all, back to our colleagues to share some of your insights on VAT reform in response to e-commerce growth and your recent experiences in that context. Let me start with my good friend and colleague Daniel Alvarez Estrada, Senior Public Sector Specialist in the Fiscal Policy and Sustainable Growth Unit of the World Bank Group, who has almost become family, I think, Daniel, with whom we have had the great pleasure of cooperating very closely in the delivery of the VAT Digital Toolkits. Daniel, welcome and thanks for joining us. Daniel, the World Bank Group has chosen very early on to form a strategic partnership with the OECD to support capacity building in the area of VAT and e-commerce. Could you perhaps share some of the World Bank's view on the importance of VAT reform to address e-commerce growth for domestic resource mobilization? Perhaps also a couple of words on the role of our common digital toolkits project in that context. The floor is yours, Daniel.
Thank you, dear Pete. Indeed, we are family now, a family of supporters of this very challenging and exciting work on VAT on digital. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to WP9 of the OECD for the invitation to share some views and reflections from the World Bank side in terms of VAT reform. The importance of VAT reform on domestic revenue mobilization for emerging and transition economies can never be overemphasized. For many decades, scholars and international agencies, including the World Bank, have been providing recommendations on tax reform to developing countries. The nature and scope of this advice has changed over time, in tandem with economic development and rapid changes on international trade, technology, and political realities. If we take a look back at half century of policy advice, it is really striking to me to see that VAT reform has been continuously placed at the center of most tax reform efforts across the developing world. By the end of the 1970s, tax practitioners worldwide came to realize that the implementation of a simple VAT system could be the most effective source of tax revenue. A lot of progress has been achieved since then. Today, as Pete, you have mentioned, VAT is the single most important source of tax revenue in most developing countries, as these countries strive to mobilize the needed social investment to achieve the Millennium Development Goals by 2030. Of course, the path to VAT reform has not always been linear. It needs to adapt to an ever-changing environment to improve its efficiency and effectiveness. At the turn of the third decade of this century, digital transformation is perhaps the most pressing challenge facing VAT reform. If we think about it, the VAT was originally designed for a very different reality, where the tax-based definition, taxing jurisdiction, and liable subjects were much more easier to define. While all VAT fundamentals are equally applicable today as guiding principles for cross-border transactions, some adjustments need to be made to traditional VAT system to safeguard its neutrality and its efficiency. The VAT Digital Toolkit project comes along as a multilateral response to a new taxation landscape posed by the digital economy. As you have mentioned, Pete, the purpose of this toolkit is to provide a practical set of policy and administrative guidance and strategies for addressing the VAT challenges of the digital trade. These guidelines can quickly and effectively be implemented at the national level by tax authorities and will be updated as appropriate to reflect the continuously changing digital trade landscape and evolution of available VAT policy and administration tools and strategies. Now, taxation for development entails now more than ever collaboration, cooperation, and consultation among public and private sector stakeholders and international organizations. The toolkit has been developed through an inclusive and collaborative process with the active involvement of tax authorities and regional organizations, representative from private sector, to ensure that it really takes due account of the specific circumstances, needs, and capacities of tax authorities across regions, and to ensure that the identified solutions are properly tailored and capable of being implemented by the different regions. A final point, if you allow me, as many aspects of tax reform, the devil is in the details of implementation. This toolkit includes a broad and very detailed set of recommendations which entail changes on countries' regulatory and operational framework underpinning VAT administration. Based on World Bank's experience supporting countries under tax reform efforts through concessional lending and technical assistance programs, a proper implementation strategy is required at the outset as a condition to improve the likelihood of reform success. For the implementations of the recommendations included in the VAT Digital Toolkit, this strategy should include critical aspects such as the proper formulation of project governance and management unit, the design of a reform roadmap, the identification of the reform team, the sequencing of reform, mobilization of IT systems, training of staff, and consultations with key stakeholders, among other key aspects for the successful implementation of the recommended policy framework as outlined by the VAT Digital Toolkits for Latin America and the Caribbean, APAC region, and Africa. Going forward, the World Bank stands ready to support countries on their VAT digital reform in coordination with our colleagues from the OECD and other development partner institutions. Thank you very much again, and wish you a very productive journal today. Over to you, Pete. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for your very thoughtful comments and feedback. And indeed, I stress again the importance of inclusive cooperation, intense cooperation, and rightly so, you highlighted the importance and sort of the critical role of cooperation and inclusive engagement in the context of the toolkits work. Indeed, by highlighting the fact that in the development of the toolkits, we have carefully worked to ensure that the regional specific circumstances, including specific design features that might be specific for a region, approaches, administration, etc., is not entirely the same in Latin America compared, for instance, to APAC and Africa. So have carefully chosen to work together with tax authorities to make sure that what is provided in the toolkits has been sense checked closely with tax authorities in the region. It has not been easy, certainly because of the limitation that COVID restrictions have placed to traveling, but actually we haven't traveled, so everything has been done online. But we have been quite successful in doing so, which also shows the motivation of tax authorities around the world to work together on this. So it's very important indeed that you stress that out, and then I can only confirm that importance of close engagement and inclusive engagement. With that, I'm happy to turn next to our dear colleagues from the ATAF Technical Committee on VAT, with whom we're currently working closely in the preparations for the VAT Digital Toolkit for Africa. Stephen Chande and Ncube Chitaishvili, who are respectively the outgoing chair and the deputy chair of the ATAF Technical Committee on VAT. Both Stephen and Ncube have been heavily involved for several years in our policy dialogue, participated in meetings of our Working Party 9, the Global Forum on VAT, and of course they have also been working to implement the solutions that we developed collectively, to have those implemented in the African region as well as within their own countries. Stephen and Ncube, thanks a lot for joining us today. It would be nice, it would be great if you could please share some of your thoughts on the importance of being involved in the development of the standards, the international standards on VAT and e-commerce, so as to ensure that they properly reflect the specific regional aspects, perspectives and circumstances. And a second question to follow up on that is perhaps share some of your experiences with specific challenges that African countries are facing in addressing the VAT challenges of e-commerce growth. I'll perhaps start with you, Stephen. Over to you, and Ncube.
Thank you, PT. And good afternoon, morning, evening, everybody. Stephen Chande is my name, from Kenya Revenue Authority, and outgoing chairperson for Technical Committee on VAT for Africa and ATAF platform. I want to confirm to this forum that the OECD has really impacted on the African activities on collection of VAT, specifically on collection of VAT under the digital environment. I am exiting from KRI to join a private practice, and therefore I will be handing over to my vice chair, and we have been involved with this program, and I am very happy now. The Digital Toolkit for Africa is almost about to be delivered, and I want to assure you, as I exceed, I will collaborate with ATAF and ensure implementation is done. For the impact that we have had, I will ask the vice chair, very able vice chair. I've been attending these meetings with her, Ncube, to ensure that we give the details of what we have done, the areas which have been impacted, and the challenges, and probably some proposed solutions. And because of time, since we were given about 5 minutes, I don't want to say much. I want to give my vice chair more time to do that, but I will be with you even when I'm not with KRI. Thank you very much for the guidance that we have received from OECD as ATAF, as Africa, and as an individual. Thank you. My vice chair, kindly.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Yes, like Stephen said, it's just to reiterate what Pete and the rest have been doing with us. Of course, VAT, like Pete said, is a very important, significant revenue earner for Africa. And that is why in around 2017 March, our technical committee was established so that we can focus on VAT. And that is why immediately after the establishment of the technical committee, we started our collaboration with the OECD, or should I say their partnership with OECD. And at that time, when we started our partnership, it was the time when the discussion on the role of digital platforms was on the table. So we were able to to get more insights, to build more confidence. And throughout this time, we've been working together with the OECD, and we've done various workshops, including the workshop on VAT GST challenges on digital economy. ATAF is much strengthened because of the collaboration, because of our collaboration with OECD. And ATAF currently has done some technical assistance to some African countries, if I can name a few: Uganda, Ivory Coast, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, and that includes even legislation, drafting of the legislation. And we have, last year, we held a meeting, which I can call consultation with the business people. And I also want to thank OECD and the BIAC for being part of that meeting, because it was consultation with the revenue authorities so that they can also get first-hand information on those business people who have been there already. Like Stephen and Pete said, the VAT Digital Toolkit for Africa is almost there, and our aim is for at least, we've targeted the mid-2020, so that by mid-2020, the toolkit is publicized. And the toolkit is a very important part of our work, because we believe that the rest of Africa will be able to be guided, even without ATAF by their side. I just want to say, for us, the toolkit, okay, before I go to that one, let me also confirm that through our partnership or collaboration with the OECD, there are some African countries which are already implementing the VAT GST international guidelines. That is, for now, is Kenya and Nigeria. And over and above the countries that I mentioned that ATAF is currently doing technical assistance, which is Uganda, Ivory Coast, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Botswana and Ghana, already they have done their legislation, even though it's not enacted yet. Their legislation is ready, and I just want to say, Africa, we are on board. This COVID-19 pandemic has also taught us to go where everyone is going. So we can see that the usual way of doing things, the normal way, has changed now to digital. So we are also going digital as Africa. And lastly, like Stephen said, we were given only 5 minutes. So I just want to say, our aim is for the African toolkit to be somehow address the challenges and opportunities of Africa, so that it makes sense to us as Africa. And lastly, let me say, ATAF, we appreciate and value the collaboration, our collaboration with OECD, and we want to say thank you very much. Thank you very much for everything. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Itumeleng and Steve. I don't know if you see it, but while you were speaking, Itumeleng, all of a sudden the sun came out here where I'm sitting. Not sure whether you see it on my head, but it's not very usual at this time of year for certainly the sun come out, and I'm sure it's in response to your testimonial. So it's for me to thank you for the great cooperation. Before I forget it, Stephen, I wouldn't forget it, but one might forget it as we're have to keep an eye on the clock. Stephen, I want to looking for the right words to properly thank you for working with us over many years already, and for your enormously important role in in basically building the foundations for what Itumeleng just described, because the model that ATAF is developing, the route that you are going, is fantastic. It essentially involves being involved at source in the development of consensus standards, make sure that your specific perspectives are taken into account, then work together in developing more detailed guidance and manuals for the implementation. Again, making sure that local perspectives, regional perspectives are taken into account. But then as organization, you are already engaging in technical assistance with your peers, some of the countries that were not in a position to travel, participate in meetings, etc. So it's actually developing standards together, handing them over to the community, the global community, so that the global community can go on and sort of spread the gospel. And meanwhile, we're developing and updating the standards again together. So that's why the sun came out. It's fantastic to hear this. And you, Stephen, you have been critical in making all of this happen within the African continent, but also beyond. Your enthusiasm and positive and constructive approach has inspired many people. So, and I'm sure, Stephen, that you will stay around and that we will stay in touch in some way or another. Itumeleng, you referred to BIAC there at a certain point. For those who are unfamiliar with BIAC, BIAC is the sort of the official, it's the terminology that we use to refer to the business community that is involved in the OECD work. And if I'm not mistaken, I think some of the BIAC members, some of our colleagues from the business community are online today as well. The list of participants is too long. I haven't checked yet, but I think some of the colleagues from the business community are online. So if so, don't hesitate to put up your hand so that perhaps we can give you the floor later on in this session, so that you can perhaps also share some of your perspectives. Without any further ado, we'll move on and travel. That's the advantage of the online format. We can now travel to another part of the world, namely to Latin America, where Chile has been one of the first countries that has implemented the recommended VAT reform for online services and digital products. And I'm very grateful to welcome Ms. Julia Altamirano, who is the head of the Indirect Taxes Department at the Internal Revenue Service of Chile. And I'm very grateful, Julia, that you agreed to share some insights on Chile's experience with the implementation of this reform. It would also be great if you could perhaps update us not only on your implementation journey, but perhaps also share some of your latest experiences now that the reform has been in place for almost 2 years, I think. So Mrs. Altamirano, the floor is yours, and feel absolutely free, of course, to respond in Spanish if you refer.
Buenos días, ¿se escucha bien? ¿Sí?
Hello, can you hear me properly? Yes. So as I was highlighting before, up to a couple of years ago, Chile did not have a reform that would allow us to apply and collect VAT on digital transactions of the digital economy. We did not have the measure that would regulate the VAT that would be applied internationally through international means to final consumers. We had some type of legislations for B2B relationship, but this legislation was a bit inapplicable. It was very difficult to put it in practice when we wanted to regulate the relationship between companies and final consumers. As everywhere, the consumption of this type of goods, even before the pandemic, was amplified lately, and therefore we needed to move towards a solution that would allow us to, on one side, to avoid the loss of this tax collection, but at the same time, avoid giving a distinct treatment to these multinationals that needed to be taxed in Chile, needed to pay taxes. Because in the end, they were not complying with the tax duties. This argument was repeated again and again with national providers, this inequality that was surging due to this context. In this context, type of tax reform was initiated, tackling several aspects. For example, the digital tax for VAT services. This reform that take form in 2020 seek to precisely align with the OECD guidelines and recommendations, in particular regarding how it would be, first of all, it would be possible to establish and determine the obligation for international providers to collect and pay these taxes. And secondly, the creation of a collection mechanism that would be adapted to these providers operating with a physical presence in the country. To sum up, we needed to establish a rule that would make providers responsible for collecting the tax and also creating a simplified mechanism that would not be that complex and that would allow for these providers to comply with the tax duties in Chile. International guidelines, reports on collecting organisms, and all along with experience of all the countries that had already adopted this type of standards were very important inputs on our tax reform process in Chile. Regardless of the possibility of transposing this type of legislation straight away on our legislation and laws without an experience and an adaptation, we see that the Chilean experience is a virtuous cycle. The more consistent we see the systems will be internationally, the easier it will be to establish a new standard for these rules. For example, the processes, the communication processes from the tax administration towards foreign providers is essential. It is easier to explain a reform that is adjusted to standard international standards instead of a very, very local reform. But the adoption process, it will be easier for international providers as well of these new systems. Obviously, for a company, it is easier to just add a new country to the IT system, a system that is used for another country as well. But actually, it is easier than developing a new system starting from scratch for a certain country. And it is cheaper and it is easier. It requires less means. This is why in Chile, adopting a reform aligned with the OECD work that did not seek to reinvent the wheel, but we wanted to make the most of these new standards, international standards, was actually an argument and an idea that actually was crucial and essential for the success of this reform. And with this, I mean very specific aspects. For example, the service providers, foreign service providers, is inside and is registered on the simplified regime, and it covers the totality of the bigger providers in the country. For example, we can find the last Tuesday, we have more than 100 companies registered on this new register, and this also translates in a very important collection for the country, tax collection for the country. In the first year of this new tax was higher than $300 million. And to answer your question, what is the actual importance of the OECD work for Chile? It is been essential to ensure the effectiveness and to standardize globally our reforms and norms. This also translates as well in a direct way in benefits for the countries. And the Chilean case, it is a clear example of how it has been very helpful. Just a tiny remark, final remark before closing my intervention. For the people listening to the translation into English, I am the head of excises. Fernando Barasa is the head, and he's also connected. And I would like to just make that final remark. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Julia, for that, again, very interesting and inspiring testimonial. It is fantastic to hear that things are going well, that compliance is positive, compliance is good, and also the revenues are even more positive, above what has been or what was expected or what was budgeted. While you were talking, this reminded me of discussions we had early on. Must have been about 2 years ago with 3 years ago already, with colleagues within the Chilean tax administration who wondered whether anyone would actually comply with these new rules. Why would they comply? Because they're not in the country. We can't make them comply, etc. And it's fantastic to hear. Actually, that what we had predicted, what we had more or less promised, that turned out to be true, and even more than true, that compliance levels are high and revenues are high. And also important to recall that you indeed highlighted the importance of consistency across jurisdictions to facilitate compliance. So thanks a lot, Julia, and we look forward to working together going forward. Which brings me to Georgia. Our Georgian colleague. Georgia has been one of the more recent adopters of VAT reform in response to e-commerce growth. We've actually heard quite positive reports on the early experiences from both the administrative perspective and the business compliance perspective. So I'm really happy to be joined by David Chitaishvili, who is the head of the International Tax Cooperation Division in the Revenue Service of Georgia. David, thanks for joining us. Very welcome. You have taken an approach that is very close to the OECD standards and guidance, I think, or I have understood. And you have also chosen to consult very closely with the business community and the businesses that were affected by the reform from very early on. So could you please give us some insights into your approach and your experiences and in engaging effectively with international business? The floor is yours, David.
Thank you, Pete. Yes, indeed. Actually, we are quite recent in terms of the VAT electronic VAT reform regarding the electronic sale of supply of services and digital products. Actually, it was last year. And our law actually was effective from the 1st of October. So basically, we had last quarter that we were just gathering the information about. And you're also true. We tried to follow closely the OECD guidelines and also engaged in very close cooperation with the businesses themselves, with the help of the OECD. And particularly business at OECD. Actually, as probably everyone understands, this reform contains like two main pillars. One is the policy matters and the changes, and the second is IT infrastructure and administrative part of the aspect. So what our communication strategy involved was from the beginning until the end of the implementation process, which is like testing of a simplified registration portal, we have engaged closely with the business, with the help of the business community at the OECD. So our communication strategy had like three main pillars. One was like timely and regular communication. Second was substantive discussions to allow simple way to comply. And last part was the testing environment with the help of the OECD. And what's most important is that all these three pillars that I'm talking about was together with the colleagues from the OECD and the business at OECD. Because you might understand that on the one hand, it is very important for the tax administration to understand nuances and important details of implementation. And on the other hand, business also needs to be involved in the process to understand what their obligations are, how these two interests of the one side of the administration and on the other side of the business interests could meet together to best provide for both needs. So I think this experience was very helpful. We managed to exchange views. We had like almost daily, I would say, almost daily communications from the representative of business of OECD. And at the end, when we went to the designing the interface of our platform, we then managed to have this big conference, including with the big, large businesses who are the main users of the platform. So we presented this simple platform, and we also heard their comments, their suggestions. And actually, it was very helpful because we took several of them, and actually most of them, into consideration. And we managed, before launching the system itself, we managed to make relevant changes while it was still not alive. So it was very helpful for both sides, for ourselves, for the businesses. And of course, when it came to the time when we needed to launch our portal, then with the help of the businesses, we did test. So the business representatives, they test run the system, they registered, they checked how things were working. Probably if whoever has dealt with the IT things, you understand that in the process of development, there are many nuances that you will see during testing time. So this was also very helpful. We here also used their experience, their suggestions. And I think by the time when system was live, it was 1st of October, all the systems, all the nuances were tested by businesses, and all the shortcomings were already covered by our IT staff. So by the time the system, the platform went online, it was already functional, fully functional, and we started to receive the registrations right away. So this was actually a really great experience. As you mentioned, I'm sure that both of us, like the government, the business, have benefited from this process. And we are still in quite close cooperation and communication, even after this process is now done. But now the second phases will start. So yeah, we are still in touch with them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. That again, another great testimonial. Interesting to hear and to see how indeed we are engaged in this sort of virtual cycle of learning from each other and sharing experience, and as one learns, others starts to benefit, and vice versa. Just to add to that, your experience, your testimonials have been very useful in the further development of the VAT Digital Toolkit for Asia Pacific and the Caribbean, so the APAC toolkit that we're currently developing. And some of the aspects that you just pointed out in terms of testing, etc., your approaches, the three-pillar approach to implementing, has been taken into account in the development of the technical checklist that we have included in the toolkit. So thanks again for your great cooperation, and I'm sure we'll continue to do so going forward. I'm just looking at the clock, and I realize that time indeed goes fast when you're having fun. I've been told that we have about 5 more minutes for perhaps a couple of quick interventions from perhaps first Anissa and then Liz from Business at OECD. Anissa, you have been waiting patiently for so long. Can I perhaps give the floor to you first and then to Liz? Over to you, Anissa.
Thanks, Pete. Good to see everyone. Look, my name is Anissa. As you've all heard, I work at South Africa's National Treasury as a Director of Indirect Tax Design within the Tax Policy Unit. So from that perspective, I just give you a little intervention from my side. South Africa's VAT legislation was introduced in 1991 and was based very much on New Zealand and Canada's legislation at the time. So in that respect, we have been compliant with the Ottowa taxation framework. as some of the guidelines, the OECD guidelines talk about. But in 2014, we introduced legislation to tax the inbound supplies of electronic services by suppliers that had no physical presence in the Republic. And this was based very much on the OECD recommendations, and it was quite successful as well at the time. Effective 1st of April, however, 2019, we amended the legislation further, and part of the amendments related to recognizing the role of platforms in relation to the cross-border supplies of services. And this would not have been possible without us knowing what the OECD recommendations were in this regard. Our participation in the Working Party 9, the Technical Advisory Group, the task teams, and the global forums has given us insights into the rationale behind the recommendations. Besides the rationale behind the recommendation, the insights into the business models that were presented by businesses themselves has been one of the most positive outcomes of attending the OECD meetings from a government point of view. This is information that we would not have had access to at that scale. These insights proved to be very influential in our decision-making process when revising the legislation. And in revising the legislation, it was vital that we took into account the business models with respect to what is or is not possible in the ordinary course of business, so that we would ensure ease of doing business in South Africa while still protecting our VAT revenue base by mitigating BEPS measures. The interaction that we've had with other countries ensured that our legislation would be on par with global trends in this regard within the realities of our jurisdiction. It also ensured that we were able to participate in such global discussions and provide insight into and at times influence decisions from an African country perspective. Needless to say that our revised legislation has been very successful. Pete showed the numbers earlier on in revenue generation, but more importantly in BEPS mitigation. The revised legislation still maintains simplicity in understanding and in administration. It maintained ease of application for these taxpayers with no physical presence in our country. The OECD meetings and guidelines honestly have been invaluable to South Africa as a country. In addition to South Africa as a country, I am the chairperson of the SADC Indirect Tax Working Group and the deputy chair of the SADC Tax Subcommittee. And in that capacity, I was able to pass on all of the information that I obtained from OECD to the other SADC countries. I've provided guidance to the SADC countries in as far as the limitations of my capacity have permitted me to. So as a result, I personally see how the OECD guidelines, the regional toolkits, and capacity building can be extremely useful, relevant, and necessary for developing countries. And I'm really pleased to have been a part of all of this, and I really wish the OECD well in continuing with the regional toolkits. It really is a gem. It's well worth it. Thank you for it.
Thanks so much, Anissa, and thanks so much as well for the very long-standing cooperation with you representing South Africa, but also as representing SADC in our work. It has been an absolute privilege to work together. And again, look forward to continuing our cooperation. I'm hearing noises in my headphones from the organizers that we will need to stop here as people are coming in for the next session. Let me first refer you to the chat where our business colleagues have outlined some of their experiences and some feedback, highlighting indeed the importance of engagement between businesses and tax authorities, which is indeed, as David said, sort of, if well organized, is a win-win, both for tax administration and businesses. And we have an increasingly sort of body of experience to show that that is indeed the case, that there is indeed a very good case for early engagement between tax administrations and businesses, and also very good case, very strong case for consistency in approaches across jurisdictions. We could probably go on for another hour or so, but we don't, unfortunately, we don't have that luxury. Let me just encourage any of you that have further questions, further comments, certainly to reach out to us. You have the email addresses on the presentations on the slides that were presented today and that we will be making available to you all. As I said, inclusiveness is part of our DNA, so that doesn't stop at the end of this presentation. On the contrary, so again, don't hesitate. If you have any questions, you want to engage with us, just reach out, send us an email, and we'll follow up to you. So this brings us to the end of this session. Thanks so much for all of you to have joined us and to have stayed with us. Thanks so much for our colleagues from around the world who have joined us to provide a testimonial of their experiences. I'm also sure that they would have loved to say more and talk longer. There will be other opportunities for that, I'm sure. But for now, thanks a lot. Everyone have a good rest of the day or a good rest of the night or evening, wherever you may be. Let's stay in touch and let's take care. See you soon again, ideally in person rather than virtually, and take care. Thank you.